From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Thursday, August 6th, 2015. As violence flares up in the West Bank, we'll hear from Eve Spangler. She's the author of Understanding Israel, Palestine, Race, Nation, and Human Rights in the Conflict. And on the 70th anniversary of the U.S.'s atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Japan, we'll turn to Dr. Jimmy Hara of Physicians for Social Responsibility. He's one of the leading anti-nuclear activists in the U.S. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Hundreds of migrants are feared dead after a boat carrying 600 people capsized off of the coast of Libya this week. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees estimates that about 400 people have been rescued and only 25 bodies recovered so far. The fishing boat in question was packed to the brim with refugees desperate to escape to Europe, but they encountered poor weather. Reports say that an Irish ship picked up a distress call, and when it pulled up alongside the boat, those on board gathered on one side and the boat tipped over. This year alone, about 2,000 people have been estimated to have died in the Mediterranean Sea while attempting to cross into Europe. Cristina, European leaders gather every time there is a horrific death toll like this, but are they really addressing, when they gather, the root causes of what is driving such desperation?
Well, I believe earlier this summer when the UN finally released a report about the consequences of migration. And what they reported is something many anti-war activists have been underscoring, and that's the consequences of the Western-led wars in the Middle East. And so just as in the United States, the millions of people who die crossing borders almost always tie back to Western intervention of those countries where people are migrating from. And so if we do want to find a solution to the migration problem, then officials have to start looking at their own policies.
And today is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, a historic piece of legislation that was one of the hard-won victories of the civil rights movement. Later today, President Obama plans to address the nation in a video conference to mark the anniversary. He will speak alongside Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Representative John Lewis. Mr. Lewis was a prominent figure in the fight for voting rights. A federal appeals panel yesterday struck down a controversial Texas voter ID law, saying that it was discriminatory against people of color. That law and several others gained steam after the Supreme Court in 2013 ruled against a major section of the Voting Rights Act that helped to enforce the right to vote. Texas's law is one of the strictest in the nation. Cristina, how important is it for President Obama to directly address the issue of voting rights, especially just hours before the first Republican presidential debate today?
Sure, and it's very important that he's giving the anniversary. But, it's also important in the wake of many conversations that this nation has had in the past few years regarding racial and economic injustice. And so there are also other factors that need to be considered. Some weeks ago, we spoke about the issue of politicians gerrymandering districts. Many activists and scholars have also spoken about the issue of disenfranchisement, where hundreds of people are not even able to vote because of a charge they might have on their record, and that's including minor ones. And so while I think Obama's address is going to be extremely important, particularly because it's going to be and kind of directly targeted toward the Republican candidates, I also think we should be mindful of the various oppressive strategies that Republicans have employed that include but extend beyond voter ID laws. So it'd be nice if President Obama included those as well.
And by the way, on tomorrow's show, we'll speak with Ari Berman about his brand new book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. And finally, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Virginia ruled yesterday, narrowly, against law enforcement's warrantless tracking of cell phones. According to The Intercept, the ruling court rejected the third-party doctrine, which is a legal theory that private information held by a company is not protected by the Fourth Amendment prohibitions against unreasonable search and seizure. Two appeals courts previously upheld the right of police to track suspects using their cell phone data without obtaining a warrant. But according to yesterday's ruling, the prevailing judges wrote, quote, "We cannot accept the proposition that cell phone users volunteer to convey their location information simply by choosing to activate and use their cell phones and to carry the devices on their person. Privacy advocates are celebrating but are bracing themselves for a Supreme Court hearing on the case, which is looking quite likely. Christina, how important is this ruling, given particularly how widely used cell phones are in our society today?
Right. It's extremely important that the ruling acknowledges the wide use of cell phones to illustrate that people shouldn't have to give up their civil rights just to use something that's central to their everyday communication. But I do think, however, it's important to discuss really the lack of privacy in today's political structure. And I think what the public does have to be aware of is that, for instance, the use of social media and many other technologies, that's including cell phones, there's an illusion of privacy that doesn't really exist. And so now that isn't that we use these technologies so we have to give up our civil rights. Obviously, we should not. There shouldn't be an ultimatum, right? There shouldn't be either use it or give up your rights or don't use it, right? But what it really highlights is the state's ability and willingness to take advantage of these technologies for the purposes of surveilling us. And so I do think we have to be aware of the surveillance state and how it will shape our everyday use of technology. So in many ways, we should be hyper aware of everything we do with today's technologies. And of course, that's including cell phones.
Cristina Mislan, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism, and she's our daily Newsflash guest expert. We will be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. 4 Palestinians were killed and 30 wounded this morning when undiscovered ordnance from last summer's Israeli war on Gaza exploded. The 4 victims were all from the same family. A year ago at this time, the 51-day war was still raging, and it was ostensibly triggered by the killing of 3 Jewish Israeli teenagers by members of a Palestinian organization. Israelis and even Americans grieved for the boys. In the past few weeks, Jewish Israeli settlers and right-wingers and soldiers have killed several Palestinian children. 18-month-old Ali Dawab Shah died when a Palestinian home was engulfed in flames after settlers firebombed it. 15-year-old Laith al-Khalidi was shot in the back by an Israeli sniper immediately after. And Mohammed al-Kasbeh as well as Mohammed al-Masri were shot and killed in separate incidents. But there has been little attention paid to the lives of Palestinian children, symbolizing the impact of the long-standing Israeli occupation. My guest is Eve Spangler. She is a sociologist and human rights activist, and she's the author of the book Understanding Israel-Palestine, Race, Nation, and Human Rights in the Conflict. Welcome to Uprising, Eve.
Thank you very much, Sonali. That was a wonderful intro.
Thanks for joining us. Now, there was a swift and strong reaction from Israeli officials calling the firebombing of the Dawab Shah home a terrorist attack when the 18-month-old baby died. How important was that condemnation?
I think it is, from their point of view as publicity, a necessary condemnation, but a bad faith one. Obviously, the individual settler who chose to open that window and lob that firebomb into a family home where an infant was sleeping made an individual choice for which he can be held responsible. I use the male pronoun advisedly because there were witnesses who say it was men. But when people make individual choices, they make it in the context of their society and the messages that they've gotten from their society. And in the case of an Israeli settler in the West Bank, his whole life is based on illegality. The settlements are illegal. His whole life is based on the Israeli state supporting that choice of being living illegally on other people's land, supports it materially with water, with roads, with the electricity grid, supports it financially with tax breaks, with better schools in settlements, and supports it morally and culturally. That settler makes the choice in the context in which he has watched the Israeli Defense Forces protecting other settlers who burn Palestinian orchards. So the notion of arson and firebombing is in that culture. That settler makes that choice having listened to perhaps Rabbi Eli Ben-Dahan, who is now the second in command of the military government that governs the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank. And Rabbi Dahan has said that Palestinians are not human, they are subhuman beasts. So and people of course react adversely to the horrible racism of that statement, but I think they underestimate its importance, because if you are a clergy person in any of the monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, you believe in a single God, and that makes us all brothers and sisters. So then if you want to systematically mistreat or expel people, you have a dilemma and a contradiction, and then just announcing that some number of people are subhuman goes to resolving that contradiction. So that settler who made this horrible choice of throwing a firebomb into a family home did so on his or her own, but did so in a context that made that choice all too easy.
And even though the Israeli government did verbally condemn the attack and the killing of the baby, when Palestinian babies grow up, particularly boys grow up into teens, they seem to be routinely considered as acceptable targets for the Israeli military. In the case of the baby, it was a settler. It was an individual who you could sort of say that he acted on his own and acted as an individual, but the Israeli Defense Forces routinely kill Palestinian teenage boys. I mentioned 3 names just in the last few months alone. I mean, what's really the difference between the vigilante violence of settlers and the militarized violence of the IDF?
I guess the firepower of the weapons, which are your and my tax dollars at work, because Israel receives almost unlimited financial, military, and diplomatic support from the United States. So I guess those are differences, maybe distinctions without much difference.
Right. Now, between what's happening, of course, within Israel is also interesting. This past week, not only were Palestinians victims of right-wing Israelis, but Israelis as well. There was an ultra-Orthodox Israeli man named Yishai Schlissel who stabbed 6 people during Jerusalem's Gay Pride Parade. A 16-year-old girl was killed. And the ultra-Orthodox communities have been very useful for Israel to colonize Palestinian land. But when, of course, they attack fellow Israelis, it's not, this sort of presents a bit of a very serious paradox for Israel, doesn't it?
Well, it's certainly a publicity problem in some measure, also because Israel engages in a lot of what you could call pinkwashing, which is to appeal to Westerners on the grounds of being so Western and tolerant of homosexuality. As a very good Palestinian friend of mine says, there are no pink checkpoints in the wall where you can go and say, hey, I'm gay, and then they say, oh, come on in. And in fact, the whole pinkwashing thing is also a bit of a sham, because one of the things that the Israeli state routinely does and sweeps through the gay bars and communities in Tel Aviv is if they catch a Palestinian who's gay, they try to force him into becoming a collaborator, and they try to blackmail him with outing him in his own community. So, the pinkwashing claim is problematic. But I think in general, the Zionist political project, which is to create an ethno-religiously exclusive state in an area, in a physical geographic space that has been from biblical times forward extremely multicultural and multiracial, creates all kinds of problems for Israelis. And then, of course, Israeli society is not monolithic, and so then there also come to be conflicts within Israeli society about whether you suppress or whether you ethnically cleanse, how aggressive you can be in pursuit of your aims, what your timeline is for achieving ethnic cleansing. So all of those, the project is inherently conflictual, I think.
Right. And the existential threat to Israel that Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, constantly invokes also very seriously impacts regional political issues, such as, for example, the U.S. attempt to have a nuclear agreement with Iran this week. President Obama made a very strong statement. He said it would be an abrogation of my constitutional duty to let Israel interfere with this deal. But setting Obama aside for the moment, Netanyahu is going to be meeting with members of Congress in the next few weeks who are being flown to Israel by AIPAC. Every single freshman congressman, but three, are traveling to Israel to meet with Netanyahu. He's going to try to convince them to vote against this Iran deal. Is there any other country in the world that has this kind of relationship with the United States?
Not that I can think of. Certainly, Iceland isn't doing that sort of thing. And no, I don't think any other country is so blatantly intervening in the domestic politics of the United States. We do align with other countries like England out of whatever historic friendship and interest, but I don't know of any other foreign dignitary who would accept an invitation to the Congress that contravenes all protocol. So no, this is the unique Israeli-American relationship that we're seeing play out here.
And is President Obama, even though, of course, in action he's been pretty pro-Israel, how close has he come to, compared to other U.S. presidents, to at least verbally, standing up to Israel, if you will?
Well, a few other presidents have done so. George Bush, the elder, did so in a round of negotiations when in 1989, 1990, the Soviet Union had just collapsed and Israel was looking for a lot of money to support Jewish immigration to Israel. George Herbert Walker Bush tried to say a freeze on settlement building is the price of continued uncritical American support. He was a one-term president. And so, the Clintons limited themselves to saying this or that was unhelpful, but they never cut foreign aid, they never cut military aid, they never cut diplomatic support at the UN. So this is, for Obama, carving a path. He's not the only person who's ever stepped out on that path, but he's one of the very few.
Eve Spangler, let's turn to specifically some of the things you discuss in your book, Understanding Israel, Palestine, Race, Nation, and Human Rights in the Conflict. It was interesting that the word race is the first word in the subtitle of your book, and you have a chapter in it entitled Zionism, the Idea That Changed Everything. How do you explain Zionism in a nutshell to an American who might, really have no idea what it means?
Okay, well, I think the way Americans can grasp it best is through something they do know, which is the civil rights movement and the history of Black America. So you have Jews in Christian Europe, interestingly, not Jews in the Muslim world, where they were much safer and much better treated than they were in Christian Europe, which was quite anti-Semitic. But you have Jews in Christian Europe, the target of anti-Semitism. You have Black people in America with that whole ugly history, of course, of racism and lynchings and intimidations and Jim Crow. And so you have communities, Jews in Christianity and Blacks in America, who have a problem with their host society. And a great many people, of course, use the assimilationist response. They just want to go along to get along. If they have to hold a job and get the kids off to school and remember to send their mother-in-law a birthday card, that's work enough. And that would be the assimilationist strategy. There are people who have the energy, the foresight, the courage to want to reform the system that mistreats them. And so you have clearly the civil rights movement in the United States, and you have often socialism is the tool chosen by Jews in Europe. And then you have a very small minority of people who think nothing will work and they want to exit. So you have the Back to Africa movement in the Black community in America, and you have Zionism in Christian Europe. And this is a political project to create a sort of ethno-religious or ethno-racially exclusive state for the safety of your people somewhere else. away. And I think the parallels are really exceptionally strong, with the exception that we have to admit that Israel is certainly economically more successful than Liberia. But that said, both Back to Africa and Zionism didn't actually appeal to most of the people who were supposed to benefit from it. Most people said, "You want to go where? You want to do what? See you later." And so they survived on the fact that their leaders were very astute and could create political lobbying efforts, could fundraise, could recruit settlers. They succeeded by having allies. Some of those allies were real human rights advocates who just wanted everybody to be able to go wherever they wanted to go. But many of their allies were profoundly racist. And for them, Back to Africa or Zionism was a way to get Black people out of America or Jews out of Christianity. And finally, they made very opportunistic choices about where the colony, where the settlement was going to be, based on where great powers would cede land to them. And they both rode roughshod over the rights of the indigenous population. So I see a real parallel between Zionism and the Back to Africa movement, which is something that also I think Americans don't think about all that much, but if they think about it even a little bit, they will have an intuitive grasp of it.
Has the idea of Zionism changed in recent years? Can one be a Zionist and be pro-Palestinian today?
Well, today, in the political climate of the Netanyahu regime, that is, of course, very difficult. I think early in the Zionist project, there was certainly a debate between a kind of cultural Zionism, which saw Palestine as a homeland for Jews. It is historically probably the most multiracial, multi-ethnic place in the world, situated on the land bridge between Europe and Asia and Africa and Asia. Everybody's been there from biblical times forward. And so there were Zionists who talked about a homeland and adding themselves into the mix in a respectful way, which, for example, the Samaritan community in Nablus, a very militant city in the West Bank, there's a community of Jews, the Samaritans, who are treated as Jews by the Israeli state, Israeli passports, Israeli license plates, and they are unmolested by their Palestinian neighbors who say, they come to be our neighbors, not to be our overlords. We have no problem with them. And, when I first heard that, I thought, well, I'd like to see that for myself. But now I have gone to Nablus and I have seen it for myself. So there was that strand of Zionism. I guess, hypothetically, it could be revived, the kind of cultural Zionism. Members of that movement were some pretty smart people. Martin Buber, I have some quotes here. I'll have to turn away from the camera for just a moment. But Martin Buber said that excessive nationalism could lead only to, quote, a tiny state of Jews, completely militarized and unsustainable. And he said that, 50, 60 years ago. Hannah Arendt said, a Jewish homeland should never be sacrificed to the pseudo-sovereignty of a Jewish state built on Arab suppression. So there were those voices, but, they were not the voices that prevailed. The choice pretty early in the history of Zionist settlement was to build an exclusively Jewish community in Palestine.
And today, the kind of expansionism that Israel is engaging in other parts of the world would be roundly criticized. And Israel does it in a very interesting way, of course, allowing settlers in the West Bank. Now, they were kicked out of Gaza, certainly, after many, many years. But in the West Bank, you see these settlements springing up. When the Israeli government refuses to let them expand, of course, they react violently, like in the case of the killing of the 18-month-old Ali Dawabsha. But in general, we see these settlements that are eventually so large that they become connected by roads, and it becomes a sort of de facto annexation of Palestinian land. The same sort of thing is done through the so-called apartheid wall or separation wall. Israeli calls it a security wall, where basically Palestinians little by little are losing their land, this piecemeal colonization. What
Yes.
is the end game? I mean, you wrote your book as a way to educate Americans about this conflict who don't know much about it. How do you explain what Netanyahu's, or not even his specifically, but what is Israel's end game for Palestinians? The hope that they may either assimilate into Israeli society or simply be absorbed into other Arab nations and stop bothering Israelis?
Well, yes, I think, the history of Israel and Palestine is in some ways historically unique because there's a fairly constant cast of characters, the Zionists on the one hand and the Palestinians on the other, and they have always been very explicit about their aims, and they've actually usually acted according to what they've said. So it's a unique case in which people say what they mean and mean what they say and do what they say.
Hmm.
And Zionism from early on talked about the transfer, by which they meant ethnic cleansing. And, it came in waves during the establishment of the State of Israel. It was militarily executed, and you drove people out by military means. The dilemma was then in the occupation in 1967, they took over land to which Palestinians had fled. So they got all the land they wanted and have always said they wanted, is now under their control militarily. But then they've also taken this large, mass of, for them, undigestible Palestinians. And so, the end game continues, I think, to be as much as possible expulsion and transfer. Now, since mass killings and rounding up people and putting them in cattle trucks and driving them across the border makes for very bad optics, the means they use, I think, are more often what a Palestinian political scientist has called sociocide. That is, they're not killing individual bodies, but they're making life unlivable. They're making the society untenable so that people will leave. They do this on a personal level by announcing, for example, that anything for which a Palestinian needs a permit, which is pretty much anything they would want to do, they can get a permit if they're willing to inform on their neighbors. Well, that sows the seeds of distrust in a community. They're impounding bank accounts. They have 500 checkpoints in an area 1/5 the size of New Jersey. So goods rot in trucks. They've made it economically untenable. They've made it politically untenable by arresting elected legislators. And so people gradually, they hope, will choose to leave. And those who don't are being compressed into areas that are very much like Indian reservations. They're not contiguous, they don't have good infrastructure, and they're separated from one another and completely surrounded by settlements. And those are the Area A cities.
And finally, how important is it for Americans to educate themselves about something that seemingly is so far away from us? I mean, of course, not talking about my direct audience who are quite educated about this issue. We discuss it a lot, but in general, for Americans, for the people that you hope will read your book, how important is it to educate themselves about a conflict on the other side of the globe?
Well, I think it's very important because, among other things, on the most pragmatic level, it's about 10 billion of our tax dollars every year that are supporting this. It is, according to someone very mainstream like General Petraeus, a thing that is making Americans around the world less safe. It is, the promised land of the Jews, the holy land of the Christians, right? Because Palestinians are the first Christians. Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, those are all Palestinian cities in Roman Palestine. So it's important to churches. I think it's important to everyone.
Well, I want to thank you on that note for joining us today, and best of luck with your book, Eve.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful interview.
My guest is Eve Spangler. She is a sociologist and human rights activist, and her book is entitled Understanding Israel-Palestine, Race, Nation, and Human Rights in the Conflict. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. 70 years ago, the United States, under the leadership of President Harry Truman, dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and 3 days later, Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of lives were obliterated in the bombings deemed necessary to ending World War II. A Pew Research survey has found that U.S. support for the bombings has dropped from 85% in the immediate aftermath to 63% in 1991 to 56% today. On the 70th anniversary of the only times in human history that a nation has used nuclear weapons on another nation, we turn today to Dr. Jimmy Hara. He is the Vice President of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. He served on the PSR-LA Board of Directors since 1981, including as chapter president for 15 years. He has been active with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and he's a clinical professor of family medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and residency director emeritus for the Kaiser Permanente Los Angeles Family Medicine Residency. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, before we get into history, I was a little surprised by those poll results that I cited. Certainly not surprised by the fact that there was 85% support in the immediate aftermath in the American public. But I thought that 70 years later, fewer than 56% of Americans would be supporting. The fact that all these years later, more than half of all Americans think that what we did 70 years ago was the right thing to do is a little bit shocking to me. Does it shock you?
I guess not really, because that's the reason I'm still speaking out and trying to inform the public about what nuclear weapons actually represent, the threat of actually destruction of our planet as we know it.
Why do you think there is still so much support? Is there a sort of this continued belief that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to ending World War II, and thus it was worth sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people?
And I might remind you that hundreds of thousands of people we're talking about were civilians, women, children, and the elderly, not the military, because the military were deployed at that point in time.
And so, this justification that is upheld till today, whenever there is criticism of what happened 70 years ago, the reaction is, well, it was necessary to ending World War II. How do you respond to that?
Well, I just remind people that if ever another nuclear weapon is deployed on this planet, the threat is that we could lead to things like famine. There have been studies done more recently by the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War that just a limited exchange of weaponry by, let's say, Pakistan and India, for example.
Which are both nuclear powers.
They are both nuclear powers. Their arsenals are not very large compared to Russia and the U.S., but on the other hand, just a limited exchange between those two countries could end up causing what we call a nuclear winter because of the soot and ash and radioactive fallout that would occur in that area that could lead to starvation and death, what we call a nuclear famine, over most of China primarily, because China is right in that area. And then we're talking about 2 billion people losing their lives over that decade.
Going back to history, there were the immediate deaths of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I also want to talk a little bit about the aftermath. But in the immediate deaths, as far as you know, was there ever an official count of the dead? In my research, I kept seeing very different numbers.
Yeah, most of the numbers you see, a lot of them were immediate deaths, which obviously you couldn't document one way or another.
Because people were literally vaporized. There was
Exactly.
no evidence left. There was nothing left.
And over the course of the year, actually one of my dear friends, Dr. James Yamazaki, was actually a pediatrician who was he was in the U.S. Army. In fact, he was captured at the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
And then, but right after the war, he was sent to do a study of what happened to individuals after the war. And being a pediatrician, he focused on the children primarily, but the best information he has is that we're looking at, over the course of the year at least 140,000 perishing at Hiroshima, and another 75 to maybe even 80,000 losing their lives over the course of that year immediately in Nagasaki. Now understand, that was immediate.
Yeah.
And
Those were the people who probably didn't even know what happened,
Right.
had no idea what was going on, because how do you fathom, when such a thing is happening, there's usually no frame of reference.
Yeah, and then when I'm asked to participate in events like the one that occurred yesterday,
In Los Angeles.
I usually tell the story of Sadako Sasaki and the 1,000 cranes, the 1,000 paper cranes. And she was 2 years old at the time that the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. Most of her family and neighbors perished as a result of the dropping of the bomb. But she survived, and in fact, she grew up to be a very healthy, athletic young lady. And she was in middle school with her very best friend, Shizuko Hamamoto, and the two of them were very athletic and very fast, so they tried out for the track team. And Sadako Sasaki was the fastest girl in the school, and she and her best friend, Shizuko, made the track team. But the very next day, Sadako collapsed, and it turned out she had what the Japanese call gen baku byo. The literal translation would be atomic bomb disease, what we know as leukemia.
Yeah.
And so a whole decade later, basically, Sadako contracted leukemia, and very early in her hospital stay, she was visited by her best friend, Shizuko, and Shizuko brought her a golden piece of origami paper. And Sadako asked her, "What is that for?" She says, "Don't you know, if you can fold 1,000 paper cranes, you can get any wish that you want?" And so she asked Sadako, "What wish would you want?" She says, "Of course, silly, that I get over this disease that I have, and I help you and our team win ribbons for our school at track meets." And dutifully, family, friends would, as they would visit her in the hospital, they would bring pieces of origami paper. In fact, just last year at the Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles, they had an exhibit, and in that of origami, basically. But in that exhibit, they actually had this little tiny paper crane that actually was made by Sadako Sasaki. And to this day, I'm still wondering how she made that such a tiny crane.
And so the aftermath of the horror
Yeah.
is still being felt.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you describe? I mean, there were unbelievable birth defects, of course, and then the cancers, and these are the kinds of when radiation hits the explain how the effects get passed from generation to generation, because literally your DNA
Yeah.
is impacted.
Yeah, the more rapidly multiplying cells are the ones that are going to be affected by radiation. So therefore,
Children.
Leukemia in children, and then again, it has to do with which radioisotopes were unleashed as a result of the bombing and what have you. And even in more recent years, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster.
This was the
in
nuclear
Japan.
power plant
Yeah.
disaster.
And there it kind of reminded us what the radioisotopes are and what the dangers are. One of them is potassium iodide. Well, we use potassium iodide because of I-131, so iodine 131. And that was, the interesting about that is that that entered the ocean and kelp picked it up. And because as seaweed is very rich in iodine, so as it turned out, in Japan they have nori.
People eat seaweed.
People eat
It's part of the diet.
nori, and that was an immediate problem. I-131 has a relatively short half-life, so that was part of a problem. But cesium-137 is really the diabolical radioisotope. And the reason is it's picked up by plants and concentrated in fruits and vegetables, just like potassium is. So everyone knows that, if your potassium is a little low, you eat fruits and vegetables, and that helps replenish potassium. Well, cesium gets picked up in fruits and vegetables the same way that potassium.
And so these bombs didn't just kill people immediately, they slowly killed survivors
in
of those
fact, the
initial bombs.
cesium-137, it was picked up by cattle grazing on contaminated
Grass.
hay and plants and what have you, and that contaminated the very famous Kobe beef. So that was a problem for at least a year. But it's the cesium-137 that was responsible for all of the gastric cancer that occurred in Japan. In fact, the endoscopes that were developed to detect cancer very early in the game, and that had to do with the fact that there are so many cases of gastric cancer about maybe 20, 30 years ago in Japan. But what people forget is it is not just southern Japan, but it was also Korea.
Really?
Koreans also suffered the same number of cases of gastric cancer. Why? Because the radiation fallout from both Hiroshima and Nagasaki drifted right over Korea.
Right. And that is another lesson from what happened 70 years ago, is that the consequences are unpredictable.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, Dr. Jimmy Hara, if you think that Americans have ever really collectively faced up to the Holocaust that we delivered onto the residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For 56% of Americans to so blindly think that this was a good thing 70 years later to end World War II just makes me wonder, how much of a blind spot we have on what we did.
Yeah, the problem is those who are actually educated as to what would happen in the event of a nuclear exchange, they actually are so overwhelmed by this information that they have what we call psychic numbing, where rather than getting them to act to prevent a nuclear war, they
shut down.
They
Our
totally
brains
shut down.
cannot handle the enormity of what we did.
In fact, Dr. Helen Caldicott, who was one of the real pioneers in pushing the whole physician movement, she likened psychic numbing to manic denial. So it's such a strong denial that it's almost in the form of mania, and so totally shuts down the individual.
It's what we see also when facing issues like climate change. Yesterday, Dr. Hara, as my crew was preparing images for the TV version of our show, we were debating how much physical suffering we could show, because on the internet there is a lot out there. On the one hand, the images are so gruesome that seeing them can turn people away from the issue and cause the psychic numbing, as you were saying. Turn off the TV, not think about the suffering. On the other hand, if we hold back, we risk sanitizing a horror-filled story. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, and that's the reason I usually like to share the story of Sadako Sasaki, because here's a young girl, she survived the initial bombing, and yet a whole decade later, she ends up ultimately dying of leukemia. And parenthetically, in Hiroshima, basically a year after her death, actually at a memorial service, the city got together and had 1,000 paper cranes adorning the altar at a memorial service. She only got to 644 at the time that she passed away. And parenthetically, her early wish was that she helped Shizuko win ribbons, but
this was her best friend,
as the months went by, she said, it doesn't look like I'm going to get over this illness, so my wish actually will be for world peace.
And that's a really important follow-up. How is this anniversary being commemorated in Japan? We know that politically, in the aftermath of this of these two bombings, Japan became very anti-nuclear to an extent that started unraveling in the last few years in particular. How are the Japanese commemorating this?
Well, every major city in Japan basically are having events and everything, both on August 6th as well as August 9th, and you can see literally thousands of paper cranes all over Japan.
That's become a symbol now of it?
Yeah, it became a symbol. In fact, the Sadako Memorial, in fact, 1 year after Sadako Sasaki's death, in the Hiroshima Peace Park, they erected a statue in her honor, and it's called the Sadako Memorial. And the inscription on that memorial statue reads, "Hear our prayer, hear our cry, peace on earth." And so that's really become really a very symbolic icon for the Japanese. That's why in Japan they talk about Sadako, they talk about the 1,000 paper cranes, so that we never forget, and hopefully we never experience another Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
And so let's talk about what the danger continues to be today, which I know is a very important part of the work that you do. In 2009, President Obama gave a very important speech in Prague about nuclear disarmament. Today, he's very proud of a nuclear deal with Iran. What happened to Obama's promises? Isn't the United States still one of the main perpetrators, alongside perhaps only rivaled by Russia, or the main stockpiler, if you will, of nuclear weapons, and the only country to have ever dropped them?
You're right. And in fact, I also belong to an organization called the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, which is in Santa Barbara actually, but they a number of attorneys in that organization helped the Republic of the Marshall Islands file a suit here in the U.S., District Court 9, suing the United States, and
Over nuclear weapons?
Well, I'll tell you momentarily. And then all of the nuclear nations, they filed suit against all of the nuclear nations, again, on behalf of the Republic of Marshall Islands, and that case was accepted by The Hague. The International Court of Justice accepted the case. Now the U.S. case, they dismissed it, and they're now going through an appellate process and what have you. But the case is still there at The Hague, suing all of the nuclear nations, basically. And the reason for the suit is violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6 in that treaty, basically, which says you're not going to test, atomic weapons and everything. And the Marshall Islands, over the course of a whole decade, was subject to repeated testing, primarily by the French and the United States, of nuclear weaponry. In fact, the people from the Marshall Islands point out the fact that they, over that entire decade, they were seeing the equivalent of 1.7 Hiroshima bombs every day.
Wow.
For that entire decade.
Wow.
So the amount of radiation they faced was really, truly horrific.
So has President Obama, in your opinion, done anything substantial over his tenure on this
Well,
issue?
the meeting in Prague, I think, was important.
Symbolically, though.
Well, just like, the meeting that Reagan had earlier with Gorbachev in Iceland, I think that I think he and Medvedev at that time agreed that both nuclear nations, major nuclear nations, had to reduce the nuclear arsenals, and they were in agreement there. I know our current Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, Dr. Murthy, I know, has a commitment to this issue.
But the question is, are our stockpiles decreasing, actually decreasing?
They are decreased compared to what they were in the past, certainly.
Okay.
There are somewhere around 15 to 16,000 weapons, internet globally at this point in time. But But reminding you, however, when we're talking about nuclear weapons now, they're an order of magnitude more powerful than the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, the current bombs that are usually in the megatonnage range, the trigger to set them off is a Hiroshima-sized bomb.
Wow. So the technology has been improved in the last 70
Yeah.
years to create more and more horrific
Yeah.
levels of weapons. And it's not just the US and Russia, although their stockpiles far outweigh the rest of the world's, but we have countries like India and Pakistan, as you mentioned, European countries like France, Germany, Israel continues to,
Yeah,
to
Israel
have,
and
even
the
though it
whole
doesn't
Middle
admit.
East, basically, because you're talking about a number of very large populated countries concentrated in a very small area. So all it would take is, one nuclear accident even, and you can see basically, you know, genocide, if you will, of that entire area.
Now, scientists, anti-nuclear scientists, have symbolically for years tried to point out the dangers of nuclear weapons by talking about it in terms of a doomsday clock.
Right. Yeah.
And that doomsday clock has been very close, just a few minutes to midnight
right.
for a very long time. How close are we as far as you know now? I mean,
Last I heard, I think it's back at about 3 minutes again. And that's, the bulletin of the atomic scientists is the, regular, periodical that usually publishes what the doomsday clock is. And for decades, actually, it's been, less than 5 minutes for sure.
Now, the issue of nuclear annihilation was something that was a very important one for progressive movements a few decades ago, in the 60s in particular. As the Cold War raged, the fear of nuclear annihilation was strong, and the activism against nuclear weapons was strong. And in recent years, that activism seems to have severely waned. And I'm wondering if you think people are in denial of the fact that we have so many weapons.
Yeah, but people have embraced things like global warming and what have you. And really, when you get down to it, environmental change and what have you, global warming, that basically is just a very slow global death compared to, an immediate, situation if we're talking about nuclear weaponry.
And doesn't the unpredictable weather and extreme weather that we know is going to result from and is resulting already from global warming also something that can feed into horrific nuclear accidents?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, with the Fukushima Daiichi disaster of a nuclear reactor, everyone came to me asking, well, here in California, we've got Diablo Canyon, we got San Onofre, and we're right on earthquake faults. But I reminded them, it wasn't the earthquake that did in Fukushima Daiichi, it was the tsunami that followed.
Yeah.
And guess where all the other nuclear reactors in this country are? They're in floodplains in the Mississippi, Missouri Valley and in New York and what have you. So they would be subject to the same type of horrific situation that we saw after Fukushima Daiichi.
So now supporters of nuclear energy would stop you and say, you're conflating nuclear weapons with nuclear energy and nuclear power. How do you respond?
Well, with a nuclear accident, that would be really very similar to nuclear war, if you will, in terms of all of the radioisotopes that would be unleashed. So we're talking about I-131, we're talking cesium-137 that I mentioned already, but we're talking about strontium, and strontium-90 was responsible for the leukemia that Sadako Sasaki had, as well as plutonium, which has a half-life that is in the tens of thousands of years.
So a nuclear power plant accident, which has happened more often than people care to admit, can be quite equivalent to the dropping of a nuclear
like
weapon.
Chernobyl, for example, would be another good example of, of the types of things that happen as a result of radiation. But a nuclear war, on the other hand, you've got other issues. You've got just the blast effects where glass is, become missiles in their own.
Not just the radiation effect, but the blast effects.
And then the heat generated, and then the firestorms that would develop. I mean, we're talking about a lot of, and then we've got the radiation, and then the radiation in turn, its effects are for decades, if not millennia.
Well, I think people have a false sense of security that our nuclear weapons and our nuclear power plants have so many fail-safes that the chance of accidents and the chance of weapons, of there being any kind of contamination is pretty low. As long as we keep a cool political head, we should be okay. And you're shaking your head.
Well,
we fool ourselves.
Things happen, and a lot of times, we're blindsided by events and what have you. There's a whole terminology in the military, for example, where, collateral damage. Why don't we call a spade and say collateral damage? You're talking about civilians who died,
killings,
as a result of military actions and what have you. And then you really have to get to, why are we even fighting? What are wars all about? What is the end goal? And are they truly ever accomplished by the clashes that occur?
Well, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, Dr. Hara, and for shedding some light on this issue. Thanks so much.
Been my pleasure.
Dr. Jimmy Hara is my guest. He's Vice President of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. He served on the PSRLA Board of Directors since 1981, including as chapter president for 15 years. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Kiana Turner is our production coordinator and our visual editor. And Teddy Robinson is our audio engineer, along with Kiana Turner. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.